In 1225 BCE, the Mediterranean world wasn't just prosperous, it was the peak of human achievement to that point, with five major empires controlling territories that spanned three continents in the most sophisticated diplomatic network ever created. Yet within a single generation, over 40 royal bloodlines would vanish from history, their palaces reduced to ash. We've been told this was a sudden collapse, but the archaeological record reveals something far more terrifying. Tiny fractures forming years before the catastrophe, like hairline cracks spreading through a dam before it bursts. The true revelation isn't that these mighty civilizations fell, it's that they were already falling while celebrating their greatest triumphs. The royal correspondence discovered at Hattusa reveals diplomatic maneuvering so familiar to our modern geopolitics that it's chilling. As our own global systems show similar stress fractures, could we be missing the same warning signs that Bronze Age kings dismissed before their world crumbled around them? Cracks in the foundation, 1225 to 1208 BCE. This is the last letter Ugarit ever sent. The enemy ships are already here. Our cities burn. Send aid, no aid came. In the late 13th century BCE, civilization stretched like a golden thread across the eastern Mediterranean. From Egypt to Mycenae, Hattusa to Babylon, kings sent letters in cuneiform, gold crossed mountains on donkey caravans, and priests charted the stars from rooftop temples. But then, almost all of it stopped. What could erase empires in less than a lifetime? Historians once thought the collapse was sudden. Now we know it was a slow unraveling. Foreign ships with unknown flags, crop failures in Anatolia, earthquakes striking along fault lines, scribal schools closing, bronze no longer flowing from Cyprus, then cities on fire. But it didn't start with war. It started with overconfidence. King Tudhaliya IV presses his seal into clay, renewing a treaty with a distant kingdom, Wilusa. He doesn't know it yet, but this moment marks the last time his world will feel whole, because the letter Ugarit would send has already begun writing itself. At the height of Bronze Age diplomacy, a single clay tablet could take weeks to travel. Ugarit's final plea? It never arrived. It was found thousands of years later, buried in ash, mid-sentence. This is the story of a world that collapsed before it understood it was falling. Not in darkness, but in silence. At the dawn of the 13th century BCE, the world was not divided into isolated, self-contained kingdoms. Instead, the late Bronze Age was an era of incredible interconnectivity, where vast empires and smaller city-states depended on one another for survival. A time when writing, trade, and technology bound distant peoples together, each shaping the fate of the other. From the palaces of Hattusa to the coastal cities of Mycenae, all roads led to one conclusion. The world as they knew it was at the breaking point, but the cracks were already beginning to show. King Tudhaliya IV, ruler of the mighty Hittite Empire, is at a crossroads. His reign, though marked by military triumphs, faces challenges on all sides. From the east, Assyria stirs, its growing ambition threatening the fragile peace. To the west in Wilusa, a strange undercurrent of dissent brews. Alexandru, the ruler of Wilusa, sits uncomfortably between two mighty powers, the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, each trying to exert influence. As the king of Wilusa prepares to send envoys to Hattusa, the air is thick with the uncertainty of a world where even treaties, signed in clay, are only as solid as the politics that back them. To the south in Egypt, Pharaoh Merneptah surveys his kingdom with growing anxiety. His troops have already clashed with mysterious invaders, their ships marked by strange bird-like carvings. The Sea Peoples. Who are they? Where did they come from? And most disturbingly, why are they attacking now? Egypt's once unshakable dominance in the Mediterranean is being called into question by an unknown force, whose origins remain a mystery. In the distant city of Nkomi, a bronze workshop lies abandoned, its once vibrant artisans now nowhere to be found. Ugarit, long a crucial hub of trade between the Aegean and the Levant, has begun to feel the effects of the unraveling world. The Canaanites, once part of a thriving merchant network, now hear only the winds of desolation. What was once the lifeblood of these empires, the intricate networks of trade, is beginning to fail. But in the Aegean, the Mycenaeans, known for their formidable military and advanced ships, are not idle. They sail to distant lands, destinations unknown to most, and bring with them both commerce and destruction. The ancient city of Troy, already under pressure, will soon face an assault that no one could have foreseen. And as the shadows of war gather, the question remains: who will survive the coming storm? Who were the sea peoples? Were they the orchestrators of destruction, or simply a symptom of a world teetering on collapse? The empires of the Bronze Age are about to fall, but how did they rise? And what part did every thread of connectivity play in the unraveling? In the heart of Anatolia, in the year 1225 BCE, a treaty is renewed, a fragile lifeline for a dying empire. But for one ruler, this treaty could either secure his throne or lead to the unraveling of everything he's built. Across the Aegean, the ruler of Wilusa, Alexandru, faces mounting pressure from two sides. The Mycenaeans to the west, their fleets ever advancing, and the Hittites to the east, offering security but at a price. Between these powers, Alexandru stands torn, as the future of his kingdom hangs by a thread. But the stakes are not just for Wilusa. The shadow of the Mycenaeans looms large, and their influence extends far beyond the simple act of conquest. Their naval dominance is the key to controlling the Aegean, and with it, the trade routes that sustain all of Anatolia's economies. It is not just a question of land, but of survival. Across the Aegean, the ruler of Wilusa, Alexandru, faces mounting pressure from two sides. The Mycenaeans to the west, their fleets ever advancing, and the Hittites to the east, offering security but at a price. Between these powers, Alexandru stands torn, as the future of his kingdom hangs by a thread. In Hattusa, King Tudalia IV feels the pressure mounting as well. The Mycenaeans' envoy speaks not just of alliances, but of what might come if the treaty with Wilusa is not honored. The Mycenaeans will not be ignored, the ambassador says. A veiled threat, one that could unravel Hattusa's grip on Anatolia. With every passing day, the fate of these empires is bound together, and yet torn apart. A new power rises in the east, and the strange ships are seen on the horizon. The seeds of collapse have been sown. But the question remains, will the Hittites succeed in renewing their grip on the western frontier? Or will the Mycenaeans sweep in with their fleets, altering the course of history? The tides of war are turning, but who will control the current? In the year 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire stretches from Anatolia to the edges of Mesopotamia. But even in the heart of its power, a tremor of uncertainty stirs. A new threat has emerged from the seas, a shadowy force whose true intentions are still unknown. Reports from the coast speak of strange ships. No markings, no banners. The winds bring them from across the Aegean, from lands the Hittites know, but whose fleets they've never feared. Are these the sea peoples, or something worse? Meanwhile, in the waning shadow of the Trojan War, Agamemnon is confronted with reports from the eastern Aegean. Ships, foreign and hostile, have been sighted near the islands of the Cyclades. The Mycenaean king knows that if this is true, the very sea that once protected them may soon become their undoing. My king, these ships are unlike anything we've seen. Their sails, dark, almost unnatural, and they come in greater numbers than any raider's fleet. This is no simple piracy. Uncertainty begins to creep into Agamemnon's heart, but he cannot afford to show it. Mycenae's power is on the edge, and now it seems there is a new empire rising from the sea. But who commands them? And why are they here? From the shores of Anatolia, these ships grow closer. They come not with a battle cry, but with silence. In their wake, towns vanish without a trace. The sea, once a passage between worlds, has become a graveyard. Tudhaliya knows what he must do. The Hittite Empire is a juggernaut. But even the might of the East cannot prevent the slow collapse of a world that no longer fits. What do these invaders want? Who are they really? And what will the empire do when the borders are breached? The first dominoes, 1208 to 1190 BCE, the Bronze Age was teetering on the brink of collapse. The world was a patchwork of fragile alliances, mighty empires, and vibrant trade networks. At the heart of this network were the great powers, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, and the smaller, but no less significant, city-states like Ugarit and Troy. However, a dark shadow was beginning to loom over the known world, an impending catastrophe that would change everything. In the period between 1208 BCE and 1190 BCE, the world would begin to feel the first violent tremors of the Bronze Age collapse. In this world of uncertain power, trade, and diplomacy, one seemingly small event would start a domino effect, unraveling the interconnected civilizations of the time. The clay tablet was still warm when it left Amurapi's hand, his last words to an ally who never replied. We begin not in a battlefield or a throne room, but in the flickering light of a royal archive in Ugarit. The year is around 1191 BCE. A scribe copies down the frantic words of King Amurapi. The enemy ships are already here. My cities are burning. There is no army left. The recipient? The king of Alatia, Cyprus. But archaeology confirms the tablet was found unfired in the kiln, meaning it was never sent. Pharaoh Merneptah is deep in his 10th regnal year. Libyans have allied with mercenary raiders from the sea. In the great Karnak inscription, Merneptah records his victory, but the tone is cautious, almost fearful. This is not conquest. This is survival. The 9 bows are laid low. The sea peoples have been repelled, for now. But already in Byblos and Ashkelon, signs emerge. These raids are no mere skirmish. They are migrations, conquests in motion. A Mycenaean contingent, perhaps Ahiawan mercenaries, may have indirectly supported or failed to stop early sea peoples' raids, destabilizing trade routes that fed both Ugarit and Cyprus. In the harbor of Ugarit, a bronze merchant scale lies bent and warped, not stolen, left behind. Trade had collapsed not because it was attacked, but because the system had already hollowed out from within. Far from Egypt, in the Anatolian highlands, another crisis unfolds. The last king of the Hittites, Suppiluliuma II, faces famine, rebellion, and internal dissent. In a Hittite text, he writes, "My subjects have no grain. The ships from Cyprus did not come. A once flourishing superpower now begs for barley." Meanwhile, in Wilusa, known in later Greek myth as Troy, a vassal king named Alexandru renews a treaty with Tudhaliya IV, but cracks are showing. The treaty stresses loyalty in times of disruption. This was no symbolic clause. Wilusa faced the double threat of inland Hittite weakness and growing Mycenaean ambition. "If you break faith," the tablet says, "you will be as ash in the wind." At Ugarit and Nkomi, evidence of bronze tools abandoned mid-casting suggests not just invasion, but that artisans dropped their work while the cities were still functional. The fear came before the fall. Atop the charred battlements of Ugarit, a lone coastal beacon burns, not as a warning, but as a signal unreturned. The fifth regnal year of Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Ramesses II, ruling over an Egypt still swollen with wealth, but quietly hemorrhaging stability. The man who sits on the throne of Egypt is not young, not a warrior raised in camps like his father. Merneptah rules with papyrus, not spear points. The empire's veins are brittle, its pulse erratic. Then the news arrives. A dispatch from the Libyan frontier. Ships, dozens, unlike any seen before. Protruding prows carved like birds of prey, painted faces, foreign tongues, weapons un-Egyptian but lethal. In the inner sanctuary of the Temple of Amun, Merneptah orders a message carved not for the living, but for the ages. 28 lines of granite, the Merneptah stele. Most eyes would only read the victories. But in its closing line, a whisper of something stranger. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. Scholars later fixate on that line, but it's not the warning, it's the smoke, not the fire. Merneptah is no conqueror. He's a caretaker of a fraying inheritance. His father's monuments still tower across the land, but statues don't feed soldiers, and temples can't hold coastlines. They do not come for conquest. They come because something behind them is gone. Merneptah wins the battle. Barely. Thousands of raiders burn on the sand outside Perire. But the scribes don't write victory songs. They quietly copy maps, reassess coastlines. Then comes a sealed letter from Byblos in code. The north collapses. Ugarit does not answer. Trade is smoke. Egypt remains for now, but the network that sustains it is fraying. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't wave banners. They moved like a tide of dissolution. Libyan tribes, shirted mercenaries, Shekelesh warriors, and families with wagons, oxen, tools, children. They fought like invaders, but lived like refugees. At Perire, General Kamnet Jeru reports a strange sight. Their women wept when we closed the sea route. This was no raiding party, this was relocation. Reliefs at Karnak later show them distinctive helmets, horned, bird-proud ships. But more telling, crates of grain, bundles of tools, crude domestic items among the corpses. They weren't destroying Egypt. They were fleeing something already destroyed. In a recently translated ostrakon found near Memphis, a mid-level scribe makes a quiet note. The Shurdans say the grain cities in the west no longer answer. Waters boil, smoke is in the harbors of Troy. No mention of Mycenae, no word from Hattusa, no word from Wilusa. The world is going silent. The Merneptah stele is the earliest known inscription naming Israel, but its placement isn't triumphalist. It's almost incidental, a grim footnote about movement in Canaan. This suggests early Israelite groups were not a political entity, but pastoral survivors amid the wreckage. Libyan chief Mycenae coordinated attacks with the Sea Peoples, yet his alliance was pragmatic, not ideological. His people were starving, his warriors were hired, his allies were fleeing burnt cities on foreign shores. Shirted mercenaries later appear as Egyptian guards. Some survivors were integrated. This collapse wasn't a clean break, it was absorptive chaos. Merneptah dies not long after. No pyramids, no great battles after Perire. Only the stone remains, left in the Temple of Ptah, then buried by time until 1896. When it is pulled from the dust, scholars don't immediately realize what it represents. Most focus on the biblical connection. Few ask, why does this stone, carved with the stylus of a victorious pharaoh, feel like a eulogy, because it was. Not for Egypt, not yet, but for the world that made it powerful. They arrive without gods. They burn what they do not take. They do not answer when we name them. Egypt stands at a crossroads, its past defined by chariot-driven battles of glory, its present clouded by trade disruptions, disloyal vassals, and foreign incursions by sea. Not all invasions begin with warriors. Some arrive with grain baskets and leave fire in their wake the 5th year of Pharaoh Merneptah's reign. Egypt still wears the crown of empire, but beneath the gold and granite lies a truth few in Memphis will admit. 1. Harvests are faltering. 2. Tomb builders demand back pay. 3rd, Libyan chieftains ride closer to the Nile each season. Merneptah was nearly 60 when he inherited the throne, a king never meant to rule, chosen in the chaos after Ramses II's long reign ended. He inherited not strength, but fatigue. In the oasis towns west of the Nile, Egyptian outposts report an influx of foreign caravans, men with strange dialects, women with no tribal markings, ships with hulls painted in geometric flame. These aren't just raiders, they're entire civilizations unmoored. Mycenae, leader of the Libu, doesn't want war. He wants land. He offers a pact: settle his people west of the Delta in return for allegiance to Egypt. But Merneptah, advised by General Kamwaset, one of the last commanders trained during the reign of Ramses II, refuses. "You bring foreigners into our house," he says, "then ask us to share the grain bin. We are already starving." Mycenae leaves, but not alone. With him march war bands of Sheridan, Ekwesh, and Shekelesh, names that will later be carved in terror into Egyptian stone. Merneptah orders the Nine Bows campaign, a multi-front counterattack. Egyptian chariots meet strange tactics. 1. Enemies wield bronze weapons of Cretan design. 2. Their archers use poisoned reeds unknown to Egypt. 3. And among them, women fight, children follow. This isn't war, it's a migration turned militant. Merneptah's Israel Stele will later boast, "The foreigner is felled, Canaan is plundered, Israel is laid waste." But within the temple of Ptah, Merneptah admits something chilling to his scribes. "We defeated men without countries. They have nowhere to return. They will return here." 3 weeks later, smoke is seen from the port of Gaza. A papyrus letter arrives from the Canaanite vassal city of Gezer. "The harvest has not come. Our neighbors are gone. There are sales where there were fields. Egypt is intact, but the frontier has gone silent." From Ashkelon to Megiddo, reports emerge of ghost towns. Fortified cities remain, but their allies vanish overnight. Egypt sends no aid. The pharaoh is dying, and the sea peoples, despite their loss, have learned the paths of the land. History remembers kings. But collapse always begins at the edges, in the quiet places no one sees until they're gone. The fall of Troy didn't burn once. It burned in layers. But in the final fire, something ancient died, and something terrifying began. On a wind-blasted acropolis above the Dardanelles, Troy still stood, but not for long. Letters from Hattusa stopped arriving. The roads from inland Anatolia were no longer patrolled. From the Aegean came ships, faster, sharper, less diplomatic. A priest named Kalmitu, born in Wilusa but educated in Ugarit, wrote one of the last recorded inscriptions before Troy fell. "The gods have left the hill. The mouths of the sea speak in tongues I no longer know." On the night Troy burned, Kalmitu's words were scratched into the limestone of a water cistern. That cistern was sealed by ash and found centuries later. But no body was found. There was no Helen, no Achilles, but weapons of Mycenaean design were found amid Troy's last burned walls. Pylos' final tablets mention rowers, bows, and armor stockpiles. A war machine had been activated, but not for glory, for plunder. And something was different. These weren't organized armies. They were fragmenting kingdoms' debris. Rogue warlords, deserters, displaced sons of crumbling thrones. And they came hungry. Weeks after Troy's fall, a merchant ship docked at Ugarit. Its captain brought olive oil and gold rings from Hattusa. When asked where he got them, he simply said no one was left to sell them. Ugarit's final dispatches: if history is written by the survivors, what do we make of a kingdom whose last words were never finished? Before the collapse, Ugarit wasn't falling, it was thriving. 1. Warehouses bulged with Cypriot copper and Egyptian gold. 2. Diplomatic cuneiform letters from Mycenae, the Hittites, Al-Ashia, even Babylon, crisscrossed its archives. 3. Its scribes spoke 6 languages. Its temples saw 3 religions. Its harbor received 4 continents' cargoes. But something strange was unfolding in the ledger tablets. Ships that should have arrived didn't. Bronze production quotas dropped. Scribes began requesting weapons instead of ink. A merchant sends word from the southern docks. The crew is local, the hull is not. They don't speak Hittite or anything. 1. Hammurabi writes a diplomatic plea to Al-Ashia, warning that unknown ships are raiding northern towns. 2. But as RS 18.147 makes clear, he doesn't ask for help. He warns, they have done evil things in my country. He assumes Al-Ashia already knows who's coming. Meanwhile, internal Ugarit letters reveal rising tension. A letter from a temple priest asks to move sacred objects inland. A copper supplier from the mountains writes, there is no city to send to. A courier leaves the palace for the harbor with an urgent dispatch. The ship's gone. The message never left Ugarit. Ugarit didn't fall because of one enemy. It fell because its operating system failed. Its palace bureaucracy dependent on stable trade. Its military minimal and outsourced to Hittite oversight. Its alliances all silent. The port city of Minet el-Beta, Ugarit's lifeline, is found charred. No battle, just fire. Ugarit's final moments weren't a siege. They were a network collapse. Its roads, ships, and letters all snapped in weeks. Around 1190 BCE, Ugarit, an important city-state situated on the northern Syrian coast, was in a precarious situation. A hub for trade and diplomacy, Ugarit had long stood as a key player in the late Bronze Age system of interconnected powers. But this period was rife with instability. Empires once formidable, such as the Hittites, were crumbling, while new mysterious forces from the sea began to encroach. The Sea Peoples, a confederation of marauding tribes, were no longer a distant threat. They had arrived at the gates of the ancient city. For Hammurabi, the approaching disaster wasn't immediate. Initially, it was a series of small, isolated raids along Ugarit's coastline, as strange vessels with unfamiliar markings appeared in the distance. The Sea Peoples, at first, seemed like an anomaly, a transient threat. But as months passed, their numbers grew. Ships piled up on the shores, and the city's defense system, once thought impregnable, was rendered obsolete. Hammurabi's dispatches to his allies were urgent but measured. In one of his last recorded communications, he writes of the increasing frequency of these raids and the lack of reinforcements from the Hittites. I have called upon the great kings of the West. My appeals fall like rain on parched earth, he writes, acknowledging the growing impossibility of a situation without sounding completely defeated. This message was his call for survival, though it now reads like an epitaph. On the eve of the final assault, a messenger arrives from the south, reporting that the Hittites have fallen silent, No help would come. A heavy weight settles on Amurapi's chest. A city built on commerce and diplomacy was now cornered by forces that understood neither. But the king was not without hope. His last plea for aid, a message sealed in clay, was sent one final time to the Egyptians. Amurapi's final dispatch remains intact in history. May the gods be merciful to those who defend and those who will not. But the siege was already underway. The sea peoples whose ships now filled the horizon would soon breach the walls. What would the fall of Ugarit mean for the region? Could this destruction become the spark that ignites the collapse of the entire Bronze Age world? As the flames of Ugarit's fall spread across the eastern Mediterranean, the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, now faced with his own threats, prepares for a battle unlike any his kingdom has fought before. The sea peoples were coming, and the mighty empire of Egypt would soon be tested. Pylos prepares for war. The sun set over the coastal plains of Pylos, casting long shadows across the ancient Mycenaean city. Once the palace had been a beacon of power in the Aegean, its golden walls gleaming in the daylight. But now the air was thick with tension. King Nestor, his mind burdened with age and anxiety, paced the halls of his palace. The sea peoples, those mysterious and relentless invaders, were drawing closer. The same fleets that had ravaged the eastern Mediterranean were now targeting the very heart of Mycenaean Greece. Reports of strange ships, some with unfamiliar sails, others with unknown banners, had reached Nestor's ears. The thought of an invasion was no longer a distant fear. It was a reality approaching at breakneck speed. The mighty walls of Pylos, which had once stood as symbols of strength, now felt more like fragile barriers, keeping the storm at bay. King Nestor's advisors, weary from the constant influx of troubling news, argued over what action should be taken. Some advocated for preparing the military to meet the invaders head-on, while others, fearful of the overwhelming strength of the sea peoples, suggested diplomacy if such a thing was still possible. But as the days passed, it became clear that no solution would come easily. Pylos was facing a crisis unlike any it had ever seen before. As the city's defenses were reinforced and the last-minute preparations were made, word came from coastal watchers. The sea people's ships were already sailing along the Aegean coastline. But what troubled Nestor even more was the whispered rumors of their intentions. The ships weren't simply raiding, they were aiming for conquest, seeking to seize the fertile lands of the Mycenaean world. Nestor knew his kingdom was no longer the empire it had once been. Pylos had already seen the fragmentation of the old order. His kingdom had grown vulnerable, plagued by internal strife, and the collapse of the greater Mycenaean network made their fate even more precarious. In this moment, it wasn't just about military might, it was about survival. Pylos' fate would not be determined by Nestor alone. It rested upon the shoulders of his warriors, who now had to face the greatest challenge their civilization had ever encountered. But just as it seemed the sea peoples would overrun the city, something far more ominous emerged. It was in these dire moments, when all seemed lost, that King Nestor's attention was drawn to something he had almost forgotten: the ancient records of his kingdom, the linear bead tablets. The scribes had long kept meticulous accounts of trade, alliances, and threats. But now those same records would offer Nestor an insight into his enemy's intentions. The tablets, small yet crucial pieces of Mycenaean bureaucracy, had been more than mere logistical tools. They were the watchers of the coast, alerting rulers to threats beyond their borders. These tablets revealed something unsettling. The sea peoples had left a trail of destruction up and down the coast, and in their wake, they had been recorded not as mere pirates, but as a formidable force with the ability to destabilize entire empires. As Nestor stared at the tablets, he realized that these weren't just warnings. They were a grim record of an unstoppable tide. The Sea Peoples were a harbinger of the greater collapse. His mind raced. The tablets, written in Linear B, had long cataloged his kingdom's wealth and its military capabilities. But now they spoke of something else entirely. They spoke of a world teetering on the edge of annihilation. As Nestor prepared for battle, he knew the walls of Pylos would not be enough to save them. The Sea Peoples were too many, too organized. His warriors were brave, but they were not invincible. The records from the Linear B tablets were now more than just bureaucratic symbols. They were the last remaining evidence of a crumbling world order, a time of prosperity fading away into darkness. As word reached the palace that the first of the Sea People's ships had anchored off the coast, King Nestor turned once more to the tablets, his eyes scanning the symbols that had once recorded triumphs. The final chapter of the Mycenaean kingdom was about to unfold, but the next question, one that would shape the destiny of this ancient civilization, loomed large. Could Pylos endure the storm? And if it fell, what would rise in its place? As Pylos prepared to face its fate, the scribes continued to labor in the palace, recording every detail. Yet amidst the chaos, something more profound was happening, something buried in the records of Linear B. The tablets, which had once simply chronicled the kingdom's grandeur, had begun to whisper secrets about a different time, a different world, one where coastal watchers had observed the rise of a new order. These ancient writings would hold the key to understanding the full extent of the collapse. But what did they truly reveal about the future? What role would these ancient documents play in the world that followed? The answer lay in the records themselves, in the cryptic messages left by the scribes of Pylos and other Mycenaean cities. They detailed not just the coastal threats, but the silent shift in power across the Mediterranean. The Linear B tablets would not only inform King Nestor's final decisions, but also provide a vital link to understanding the broader scope of the Bronze Age collapse. It is the year 1195 BCE. In the great palaces of Mycenae, the air was heavy, weighed down by more than the scent of cypress and fire. Here, on the precipice of history's most profound change, the scribe's work was no longer concerned with mere inventories or records of tribute. The Linear B tablets, once symbols of the Mycenaean mastery over commerce and governance, now told of a more pressing issue, an unseen threat moving along the coasts. In Mycenae, the trade routes had been the lifeblood of the empire. The Aegean Sea, once a vast highway for ships laden with treasures and goods, was now becoming a graveyard of promises. The watchers mentioned on the tablets were no longer just distant sightings of foreign ships. These were foreign ships that, unlike the regular flow of trade, seemed to have no intent but to observe and to wait. The Linear B tablets, each one a painstaking record of everyday life, began to shift in tone. There was no more space for the recounting of simple trade transactions or palace banquets. Instead, there were frequent notes. Watchers still at the coast. It was a warning, but one written in the language of unease, not certainty. At the palace of Pylos, King Nestor, his wisdom now shadowed by the changing world, could no longer ignore the signs. The coastal threats weren't just anomalies. They were symptoms of something larger, something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Yet his kingdom was already fractured by internal strife, with economic collapse looming just beyond the horizon. As resources became scarce, his authority weakened, and his people began to look to the seas, not for the promise of riches, but for the danger that was sure to come. In the great city of Pylos, just as the scribes recorded the ominous signs, The very foundation of the Mycenaean economy was slipping away. The land that had once been flush with riches from its colonies and far-reaching trade routes now faced starvation, as foodstuffs were no longer reaching the ports. The tables of wealth and the network of exchange that had been the hallmark of Mycenaean dominance were crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. The Watchers were an unsettling symbol, but they were not the true cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of an unraveling system, one that had been built too strongly on conquest and far-reaching commerce to survive when these vital threads began to snap. The moment that the first signs of warships appeared off the coast, the Mycenaeans reacted too slowly. The threat was clear, but the responses were disjointed. Cities that once flourished in the web of interconnectedness, Ugarit, Troy, and Pylos, found themselves isolated. As the coastal trade routes were severed, so too were the bonds that held these civilizations together. This wasn't just the loss of trade. This was the unraveling of the cultural and political fabric that had held the Bronze Age world in place. The arrival of the Watchers marked only the beginning. Soon reports began to arrive of other ships. Ships filled not with merchants, but with warriors, their faces hidden behind iron masks, their purpose unclear but unmistakably violent. These invaders would later be known as the Sea Peoples, but as their names and origins would remain shrouded in mystery for centuries, their impact was immediate. The Sea Peoples didn't just bring destruction, they brought the end of the interconnected world that had defined the late Bronze Age. With each town they raided, each city they burned, the very concept of security, both military and economic, began to dissolve. And in the palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and other centers, there was nothing left to do but watch as their once great civilization began to erode. King Nestor's final orders were recorded on clay tablets, among them a chilling message. The ships come from the west. The coasts are no longer safe. It was a warning, but it came too late. In the aftermath of the coastal attacks, the scribes of Pylos, who had once been the silent chroniclers of trade and diplomacy, became the last witnesses to the downfall of their civilization. Their tablets would record the chaos, the slow death of the Mycenaean world, and the growing sense of panic. The very language of the tablets began to shift. What had once been simple administrative records now carried a tone of desperation. Watchers of the coast became synonymous with enemy ships, but the scribes could do nothing but report. They were helpless to stop the inevitable collapse of their world. But there was still one final question. What did these invaders want? Were they simply pirates, or was there something more at play? Why did the Sea Peoples strike now? And why with such devastating efficiency? It was a question that no one could answer. And the answer would come too late for those who had built the greatest maritime empire of the Bronze Age. As the Mycenaeans watched their world crumble from within, the question of the Sea Peoples grew ever more pressing. Were they the harbingers of the end, or simply another force in a much larger, more catastrophic chain of events? As the final tablets were written in the Palace of Pylos, one last entry was made, a final observation of the Watchers. The last ships sail. There is no more news from the west. The coast is silent, but the sea is still dark with their shadow. The center was no longer holding, and soon all that remained was the slow but certain fall of what had once been the greatest maritime empire the world had known. With the collapse of the Mycenaean world already underway, the story turns to the unraveling of the great powers of the Bronze Age, from the Hittites to the Egyptians, and the emergence of new orders from the ashes. The events of the Sea Peoples' arrival were not isolated. They were but one part of a larger wave of destruction. As empires that once shaped the Mediterranean world began to fall, The ancient world as it was known would cease to exist. The struggle for survival in the post-collapse world would define the next era as new powers rose from the ashes of the old. The center could not hold, and soon, the entire structure of Bronze Age civilization would be swept away in a storm of violence, chaos, and the scramble for power. The center cannot hold 1190 to 1180 BCE. By the late 12th century BCE, the ancient world was descending into chaos. Once vibrant empires, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites in Egypt, had stood as pillars of an intricate world system. But cracks had begun to form, barely noticeable at first. Trade routes that connected empires like arteries through the ancient world began to bleed dry. Ports once teeming with ships now sat abandoned, and the once sturdy walls of palaces and cities lay crumbling. The great civilizations, intoxicated by years of prosperity, had ignored the warning signs. And now a storm was brewing, a storm neither diplomacy nor military might could control. In the midst of these waves of collapse stood Pharaoh Merneptah, a ruler who had inherited a kingdom rich in history. Egypt was now fighting for its survival. The Nile, Egypt's lifeblood, had become unpredictable. Floods that once guaranteed fertility became erratic, leaving harvests poor and famine creeping in at the edges of the kingdom. The heart of Egypt, once so steady and proud, was now uncertain and frayed. But Egypt was also facing something more immediate: foreign invaders. From the west, a coalition of Libyan tribes threatened the borders, while from the sea came rumors of new, terrifying enemies: the Sea Peoples. Who were these strange invaders? Where had they come from? And what was their ultimate goal? Merneptah had seen Egypt through wars, yet this crisis felt different. The Sea Peoples were not like any enemy Egypt had faced before. Their attacks were swift, and their presence was unsettling. For the first time in years, Pharaoh's authority seemed fragile. It was clear Egypt could no longer rely on its power alone to keep its borders safe. No one knew for certain who the Sea Peoples were. Some whispered they were pirates. Others speculated that they were refugees displaced by the same catastrophes that were rocking the Mediterranean world. They had been spotted raiding coastal settlements across the Aegean and Levant, but their motives remained a mystery. What was clear was their unstoppable momentum. Every time one of their raids was repelled, they would return stronger, more numerous. They seemed to be a tidal wave, relentless and without mercy. But these were not just the simple barbarians of popular myth. The Sea Peoples were a manifestation of something much larger. They were the culmination of a crumbling world order. What had driven them to abandon their homelands? Was it the breakdown of trade networks, the crumbling powers of the Mediterranean? And why were they so fixated on Egypt? With each passing month, the Sea Peoples pressed closer to Egypt. Their movements became more calculated, their attacks more devastating. For Merneptah, the situation was becoming increasingly dire. But the pharaoh was not the only ruler struggling with this new menace. As Egypt prepared for war, another tragedy unfolded across the sea. Ugarit, the prosperous trade hub on the coast of modern Syria, had fallen. Once a thriving city known for its wealth and cultural exchange, it had been destroyed in a brutal assault. The city's temples were desecrated, its royal family slaughtered, and its walls breached by invaders. For Egypt, Ugarit's fall was more than just another casualty of the growing chaos. Ugarit had been a key ally, a diplomatic and economic bridge between Egypt and the Hittites. With its fall, Egypt's strategic position was severely weakened. The Levant was now a battlefield, and the once thriving trade routes of the Mediterranean were lost. Ugarit's destruction wasn't just a blow to a single kingdom. It marked the unraveling of an entire network of power. With Egypt's borders in danger, Merneptah's position was precarious. His armies were stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts. The pharaoh, desperate, wrote letters to neighboring kingdoms, hoping for alliances that might give him the strength to fight back. His letters, etched on clay tablets, spoke of great victories in the past, but now hinted at the unraveling of an empire that could no longer keep its walls secure. These letters, though sent in an attempt to stabilize Egypt's fragile alliances, told a darker story. Egypt was beginning to lose control. Merneptah's final plea, however, was not to his neighbors but to the gods. His last prayers, recorded by his scribes, would become some of the final words of his reign. "O gods of Egypt, hear me in this hour of darkness. If the sea peoples rise against us, who can stand in our defense?" Merneptah's words would be echoed across Egypt's shores, but his pleas for help would fall on deaf ears. The sea peoples had no mercy, no diplomatic overtures. Their warships were already sighted off the Nile Delta, their sails darkening the horizon. The question was no longer if they would invade, it was when. And as Merneptah prepared for his final defense, an even greater storm loomed on the horizon, not just for Egypt, but for the entire Mediterranean world. Could the Egyptian pharaoh survive this onslaught? Or would the sea peoples be the final blow to a civilization already on the edge? The first waves of the sea peoples were already crashing into Egypt, and the Mediterranean world held its breath. The fate of Egypt, Ugarit, and the Mycenaeans was sealed. What had once been powerful kingdoms were now all but decimated. But would Merneptah's final defense succeed? Or would Egypt fall into the abyss like the others before it? The collapse of Egypt was now only a matter of time, and the rest of the world would soon follow. A dying empire, the end of Hattusa. In the midst of a dying world, Hattusa, the once mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, burned. Fire devoured the grand palaces, the libraries, and the administrative centers where kings once sat, where treaties had been signed. As the flames consumed the city, so too did the last vestiges of an empire that had held sway over Anatolia for centuries. The final days of Suppiluliuma II, the last king to sit on the throne, were not just an end of power. They were the death of an entire civilization. What had led to the fall of Hattusa? The answers lay not only in the invading forces, but in a kingdom that had grown weak from within. Its alliances fractured, its military stretched too thin. For Suppiluliuma II, there was no time for reflection. His pleas for help went unanswered. The sea peoples surged toward Hattusa's gates, and within the walls, internal dissension boiled over. The empire, which had once controlled vast territories, was now collapsing under the weight of its own mismanagement. Inside the city, the king's final moments were a blur of frantic decisions. In a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of his empire, Suppiluliuma II ordered the fortifications reinforced, but the damage had already been done. The sea peoples were not the only threat. Rebellions within the empire had already begun to eat away at Hattusa's defenses. The king's letters, sent in haste to allies and vassal states, spoke of urgent need, but they fell on deaf ears. One of his final letters, preserved in the remnants of Hittite records, reads, "The fire consumes us, and still the world turns its back. Our enemies gather at the gates. We are but shadows of what we once were." With these words, the king's fate was sealed. As Hattusa's walls crumbled, the last defenders fought not just for their city, but for the dying hope of a past era. In the end, even the grand city of Hattusa, with all its monumental palaces and wealth, could not withstand the forces against it. The final destruction of Hattusa was more than a military defeat. It was the loss of a history, of culture, and of a political system that had ruled vast swaths of territory. The royal archives, which had recorded centuries of diplomacy, trade, and military victories, were reduced to ash. The physical city was destroyed, but the emotional cost was immeasurable. For those who survived, there was no home to return to, no future to look forward to. But as the flames of Hattusa's destruction slowly died down, the world did not simply end. The collapse of the Hittite Empire left a vacuum, one that would be filled by a variety of new powers. The Mycenaeans, the Assyrians, and other emerging powers of the Late Bronze Age would now seize the opportunity. But in the ruins of Hattusa, something was beginning to shift, an unsettling trend that would define the next phase of this turbulent era. As Hattusa burned, the larger world around it trembled. The collapse of the Hittite heartland was felt far beyond its borders. But what happened to the survivors? Where did they go? And what of the city itself? Was it truly abandoned, or did something else take place in the ruins? Even as Hattusa fell, there were other cities, other regions, shifting, adapting, and preparing for their own struggles. Some, like Nkomi, had already begun to prepare for what was coming. As Hattusa was consumed by fire, it wasn't just the Hittites who faced ruin. The eastern Mediterranean was in turmoil, with cities like Nkomi, once thriving hubs of trade and culture, now teetering on the edge of collapse. What had happened to the great cities that once ruled the region? Why was Nkomi abandoned so suddenly? And what did this signal for the coming era of upheaval? Nkomi abandoned, it was not the fall of walls or the collapse of palaces that marked the death of Nkomi, but the silent desertion of its artisans. The workshops that had once hummed with the sounds of metalworking and the clanging of tools stood eerily still, abandoned mid-task. Bronze, the prized resource that had once fueled this city's economic might, lay in molten pools, half-formed into weapons, tools, and ornaments, but never finished. Nkomi, a critical hub in the Cypriot trade network, had been thriving just years earlier. Yet now it lay silent, its workshops empty, its streets vacant, its economy fractured. There were no grand invasions that marked its demise, no immediate signs of warfare, but rather a slow disintegration of its economic heart, the very workforce that had given it life. What happened to the workers? Those skilled laborers who had fashioned tools, weapons, and luxury goods. The disappearance was not merely of the artisans, but of the social fabric that had bound the city together. What had once been a thriving community now lay abandoned, its labor force scattered or lost in the chaos that swept the region. The labor classes, invisible in many historical records, were suddenly and dramatically erased from Nkomi's story. As the city collapsed, they either fled in the face of unseen invaders, perhaps displaced by forces they never fully understood, or they perished in the turmoil. But this wasn't just about the end of a city. This was the unraveling of craftsmanship, the erosion of the labor force that powered the Bronze Age economy across the Mediterranean. And as Nkomi fell, the ripple effect spread far beyond its borders. The systems that had long connected trade routes and tied the fortunes of great cities together began to fray, piece by piece. Amid the abandoned workshops, the unfinished bronze spoke volumes of a world interrupted. Tools meant for production and weapons intended for defense lay incomplete, left in the cold ash of abandoned furnaces. These fragments of craftsmanship, unfinished and unclaimed, marked a moment of history where the once invincible Bronze Age began to lose its luster. The cities that had once stood as towering beacons of artistic production and metallurgical prowess now bore the scars of an economic collapse that swept through them with terrifying swiftness. Yet even in their disarray, these abandoned works of art and industry hinted at something larger. The collapse was not just the fall of a city, it was the unraveling of a way of life that stretched across the entire Mediterranean. And as the last furnace fires in Nkomi died down, something darker was rising on the horizon. The Sea Peoples, a name that struck terror into the hearts of civilizations across the Mediterranean, were on the move. This mysterious and violent force would prove to be the catalyst for the final disintegration of the Bronze Age world. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramses III faced an existential threat. Battles fought not just for territory, but for the very survival of his kingdom. The Sea Peoples came from the sea, storming coastal cities and wreaking havoc on Canaan and Egyptian territories. Their relentless assaults would add fuel to the fires of destruction that were already spreading across the region. But Ramses III's confrontation with the Sea Peoples was only the beginning. As Nkomi fell silent, other cities faced similar fates. What did the Sea Peoples want? And why did they sweep through the Mediterranean with such ferocity? Ramses III, standing at the gates of his kingdom, knew this wasn't just a war for Egypt. It was a battle for the survival of the entire Bronze Age civilization. The forces of destruction that had already been building would now collide in a violent storm, and Egypt would be one of the last bastions of resistance. The rise of the Sea Peoples marked a turning point in the Bronze Age collapse, and Pharaoh Ramses III's battles against them would come to define the final moments of Egypt's ancient power. As the world crumbled around him, could Ramses hold the line? Or would the tides of destruction overwhelm his kingdom as they had so many others? In the next chapter, we will dive into the brutal conflicts that saw Egypt's last stand against the Sea Peoples and explore the shadow of destruction that loomed over the Mediterranean. Ramses III's Sea Peoples battles the Nile, once the lifeblood of Egypt, is now the backdrop for an empire teetering on the edge of collapse. Ramses III, the last great pharaoh of Egypt, stands at the crossroads of destiny. His empire, which has withstood the test of time, now faces an invincible force that threatens to tear apart the foundations of its civilization. In Thebes, behind the heavily guarded walls of the royal palace, a meeting is underway. Pharaoh Ramses III and his advisors discuss reports from their spies. Strange ships spotted on the horizon with symbols that don't match any known enemy. They call them the Sea Peoples. No one knows exactly who they are, but their raids along the Mediterranean coast have already devastated cities. These invaders are like shadows striking without warning, appearing in places that were once considered invulnerable. Despite their grand temples, towering pyramids, and formidable army, the Egyptians now realize that their position as the dominant power in the region is slipping. For centuries, Egypt has held sway over vast territories, but as news of the Sea Peoples' destruction spreads, Ramses III must face the truth. Egypt might not be strong enough to survive another siege. Pharaoh Ramses begins to wonder if his reputation as a military leader can withstand this unknown enemy. The royal scribes, typically focused on the empire's glory, now record these troubling events with increasing urgency. For the first time, Egypt's future seems uncertain. Rumors swirl, but the truth about the Sea Peoples remains elusive. Are they Aegean invaders, Philistines, or something entirely different? Their numbers grow as they ravage the coast of Canaan, and now they are heading toward Egypt. What drives them? Is it a desire for wealth, conquest, or something more profound? Theories abound, but the answers remain just out of reach. Behind closed doors, tension rises within the royal court. Ramses III's advisors, once proud and certain in their strategy, begin to show cracks in their confidence. Ramses's generals, seasoned warriors, whisper amongst themselves, "If Egypt can't stop the Sea Peoples, who will? Will Egypt collapse under the same pressure that brought down the Hittite Empire?" As the Sea Peoples move ever closer, Egypt's military resources are stretched thin. What if the pharaoh's walls aren't enough? What if their famed navy is no match for these invaders, who seem to come from nowhere and strike with terrifying precision? The pharaoh's forces prepare for battle. Nubian warriors, chariots, and elite archers are summoned from every corner of Egypt. The Battle of the Delta looms on the horizon, but the Sea People's strategy is as elusive as their identity. They strike where Egypt least expects, in ways no one can predict. Ramses III faces an agonizing question. Can Egypt still hold its ground? His military advisors urge him to defend the Nile Delta at all costs. But as Ramses looks at the approaching fleet, he wonders if even Egypt's mightiest forces will be enough to stop this unstoppable tide. As the Egyptians make their final preparations, the Sea People's fleet draws closer, mysterious, countless, and terrifying. The moment of truth is approaching, but just as the pharaoh orders his army to take position, another fleet, larger and more menacing, appears on the horizon. The Sea Peoples have a new strategy. They are no longer striking from the sea alone. They are marching inland. Can Egypt hold its ground, or will the pharaoh's might prove insufficient against this overwhelming force? As Ramses III prepares for the decisive battle, the events unfolding in Egypt bear a striking similarity to the fate of the Hittite Empire. The Sea People's relentless invasion, as Egypt now faces, was also the catalyst for the collapse of the once mighty Hittite kingdom. But how did the Hittites fare in the face of this unstoppable force? The answer lies in the fall of Hattusa, the Hittite capital. As Egypt stands on the precipice of its own collapse, the tragic tale of the Hittites' disintegration offers a chilling glimpse into what might be Egypt's fate. Will the Sea People's tide overwhelm both Egypt and the Hittites, or will one empire prove resilient enough to survive? The story of Hattusa's fall is next, and it will reveal the stark reality of what happens when an empire cannot stand firm against the storms of invasion. In the year 1175 BCE, the sands of Egypt are stained with the sweat and blood of battle, and the great pharaoh Ramses III stands before the inscriptions at Medinet Habu, his legacy etched into stone. But what is immortalized here is not only the triumph of Egypt against the Sea Peoples. It is a story of a fragile empire that clings to survival by its fingertips. As Ramses III gazes upon the victorious Egyptian forces, his heart is heavy. The battle fought on both land and sea was a desperate struggle, not for conquest, but for the very soul of Egypt. These sea-born invaders, Peliset, Danaan, and Sheridan, strike with unprecedented ferocity. Their numbers are overwhelming, their tactics savage, and they come from the corners of the known world, threatening to unravel Egypt's millennia-old civilization. The Egyptian inscriptions paint a harrowing picture of the Sea Peoples, coalition forces led by the Peliset, likely ancestors of the Philistines, Danaan from the Aegean, and the terrifying Sheridan, whose battle prowess was so brutal that their very name became synonymous with terror. The Egyptians, while a formidable military force, have never encountered such an enemy that strikes with precision and ferocity, taking advantage of Egypt's weakened borders. The battle on the Mediterranean waters is as brutal as any war Egypt has ever fought. It's not just a battle for survival, it is a battle for the future of the empire itself. Ramses III, the last of the great pharaohs, must push Egypt's forces to their absolute limit. On the Nile Delta, the battle rages. The Egyptians deploy their chariots, the pinnacle of military might, but their overwhelming numbers are met with an equal show of force from the invaders. The invaders' naval superiority challenges Egypt's supremacy of the sea. It's clear that the battle will not be easily won. Amidst the clashing of swords and shields, Ramses III witnesses a harrowing truth. The victory is unsustainable. Though Egypt emerges victorious at Medinet Habu, it is a hollow victory. The scars of war are visible in the city-states of Egypt, in the hearts of the people, and in the pharaoh himself. The battle may have been won, but what is the cost? Egypt's borders are weakened, the economy is frayed, and internal dissent begins to rise. As the inscription's final words are carved, they tell of the greatness of the victory, but also of the emptiness that follows it. Egypt stands victorious, but it is no longer the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean world. The Medinet Habu inscriptions conclude with a troubling revelation. Despite the victory, the sea peoples are not gone. They are scattered, their forces disbanded, but the writing on the wall is clear. They will return. Egypt has survived, but at what cost? What will Egypt face in the aftermath of this battle? As Ramses III surveys the horizon, his kingdom, once the most powerful in the Mediterranean, now faces an existential threat. One from beyond its borders, but also from within. The Sea People's battle was just the beginning. The end of this war may very well mark the beginning of Egypt's ultimate collapse. As Egypt's victory over the Sea Peoples echoes across the Mediterranean, the balance of power in the ancient world begins to shift. While Egypt may have fought off the invaders, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, falls to invaders of its own. And the Minoan and Mycenaean worlds, still reeling from their own losses, face their own unraveling. New World Disorder, 1177 to 1160 BCE, now grips the ancient Mediterranean world. As empires like Egypt stabilize, the aftermath of the Sea People's invasion will leave an indelible mark on the region. From Anatolia to Syria, the collapse of old powers leads to an unstable, fractured world. No longer will the established empires hold sway over the seas. A new order is rising, but it is uncertain and dangerous. Who will rise from the ashes of the old world? And what role will Egypt play in this new and unpredictable age? The ancient world is about to change forever. In the dimming light of the Mediterranean, where once mighty empires cast their shadows, a terrifying transformation begins. 1177 BCE marks the first signs of a disaster that will ripple through history, shattering civilizations in its wake. The Sea Peoples, a confederation of mysterious invaders, are only one symptom of a much larger collapse. But what caused it? For centuries, the great powers of the Bronze Age, the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and Egyptians, held sway over the Mediterranean world. But now all that remains is a fractured mosaic of city-states, petty kingdoms, and nomadic tribes, scrambling to survive in the wreckage of the old order. The Hittite Empire, once a dominant force in Anatolia, is no more. The majestic city of Hattusa, once brimming with the wealth of trade and culture, has been set ablaze. Its royal archives, containing the knowledge of kings, military strategies, and treaties, have been reduced to ash. King Suppiluliuma II's desperate pleas, carved into clay tablets, speak of a world unraveling faster than he can react. Meanwhile, Mycenaean Greece, the cradle of classical civilization, faces its own cataclysm. The palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos stand empty, their linear B-tablets abandoned, their artisans gone. A world of monumental architecture, advanced military tactics, and intricate trade has crumbled, but the cause remains unclear. Was it the Sea People's internal strife, or was it a combination of forces beyond the control of even the greatest kings? The term Sea Peoples invokes fear and confusion. Raiders from across the sea, they are described in Egyptian records as Peliset, Denaian, and Shurden. But who were they really? Some say they were displaced refugees, fleeing the chaos of collapsing civilizations. Others argue they were opportunistic conquerors, looking to carve out new territories from the ruins of the old world. Their role is undeniable. They attacked key coastal cities, destabilizing the region. Egypt, under Ramses III, famously repelled them at Medinet Habu, but not without suffering significant losses. Their arrival marks the beginning of the end for the Bronze Age world order. But their actions alone cannot explain the widespread collapse. There were deeper, more insidious forces at play. The great trade routes that once connected Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the kingdoms of the Levant are disintegrating. The Minoans on Crete, long a critical link in this vast network, have already fallen. The Canaanite cities, once thriving hubs of commerce, are abandoned or destroyed. The loss of these trade routes is catastrophic, as cities dependent on imported goods now struggle to survive. Artisans and craftsmen, the heart of these economies, are left without work. The finest bronze tools, once crafted by skilled hands, are left unfinished in the workshops of Encomi and Cyprus. These once thriving centers of commerce are now ghost towns. The world is no longer unified under the reign of great empires. Instead, smaller kingdoms and city-states, each struggling to survive, take their place. The Levant becomes a battleground of competing powers. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, once prosperous centers, are now isolated, each fighting to preserve its sovereignty. Egypt, though victorious over the Sea Peoples, finds itself on the defensive. Its once uncontested supremacy in the Mediterranean is no more. The Nile may still flow, but its power is waning. Egypt has been dealt a blow to its political stability, with factions vying for control. As the great Bronze Age empires fall, a new chapter begins. Iron, the next metal to shape human history, will begin to take its place. But who will master it first? The Philistines, the Phoenicians, or another power yet to be revealed? The Bronze Age, once defined by intricate palaces, monumental tombs, and luxury goods, now lies in ruins. But in the ashes of the old world, the promise of new technologies, new societies, and new kingdoms beckon. The old world is ending, but as the dust settles, new powers are beginning to rise from the ashes. The Iron Age is coming. Who will emerge victorious from the chaos? Ashkelon in ruins. In the year circa 1150 BCE, Ashkelon stood as a symbol of Canaanite prosperity, a thriving port city along the Levantine coast. Once a hub of trade connecting the ancient Egyptian empire to the Aegean, it now lies abandoned, its once proud walls crumbling under the weight of time and war. To the Canaanite elders who remain, the sight of their city's slow disintegration is more than just the destruction of buildings. It is the obliteration of their identity, their gods, and their culture. As Ashkelon's population dwindles, the sound of hammers no longer rings through the market streets. The great walls, once fortified to withstand foreign invaders, now lie in rubble, a tragic reminder of the shifting tides. The city's port, where merchants from across the Mediterranean once traded precious goods, is silent. The rituals of Dagon and Baal, performed in the grand temples that towered above the city, are now but whispered memories, abandoned alongside the homes of the people who once held them sacred. The Canaanite elder, his face weathered by time, walks through the deserted streets, his heart heavy with a grief he cannot put into words. He observes the newcomers, builders of a different kind, who have begun to erect their own structures over the sacred sites of his ancestors. The Philistines, or perhaps the Sea Peoples, have arrived, bringing their own gods, their own language, and their own rituals. Indifferent to the city's past, the temples of Ashkelon, which once stood as the pride of Canaanite craftsmanship, are now in ruins. The intricately carved stones which depicted the life of the people and their relationship with the divine have crumbled, lost forever. The craftsmen's workshops where skilled artisans once molded delicate jewelry and pottery are now abandoned, their tools left to rust in forgotten corners. The temples dedicated to Baal and Astarte stand, but not as they once did. Where vibrant ceremonies once filled the air with the scent of incense and the sound of chanting, there is now only the wind, carrying whispers of a world that no longer exists. The Canaanite script, which once marked the city's monuments, is now unreadable to the foreign settlers who have replaced the original inhabitants. To them, it is nothing but an ancient puzzle, a dead language with no use or meaning in their new world. The newcomers, Philistines, are different. Seafaring invaders who have left their marks across the eastern Mediterranean. With them comes a new culture, a new language, and new gods. The Canaanite elder watches as they erect homes and temples, building on top of his people's ruins. The quiet tragedy of it all is that the newcomers are unaware of the culture they are erasing. They see only fertile land to be shaped into their own future, oblivious to the legacy of those who walked before them. What will the future hold for Ashkelon? Will the memory of the Canaanites fade into obscurity, lost beneath layers of new settlements, new cultures, and new gods? Or will fragments of this lost civilization survive in the stories passed down by those who remain, who remember a time when Ashkelon was the beating heart of the Canaanite world? For the elder, this isn't just about buildings and statues. This is the loss of a way of life. The Canaanite religion, the arts, and the ways of governance are slipping away. The land that once teemed with the sound of rituals and celebrations now lies still. The people who once carried the legacy of Ashkelon in their hearts and hands are no more. The Canaanite elder stands alone, watching as the future is built over his past. His thoughts linger on the lost heritage of his people. Will the new inhabitants, the Philistines, carry with them any trace of Ashkelon's former glory? Or will they erase all that came before them, creating a future devoid of the rich past that once gave the city life? The city is gone, but will its memory endure? Or will this once vibrant culture fade into obscurity, forever lost to time? As Ashkelon's ruins crumble beneath the weight of history's march, another civilization is quietly unraveling to the west. On the island of Crete, the Minoans, who once ruled the seas and traded across the Mediterranean, are now abandoned, their cities in ruins and their palaces silent. Crete without kings speaks to the very same uncertainty that has swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Without their powerful leaders, the Minoan world is left adrift, much like Ashkelon, where the structures of the past have been washed away by the tides of change. How will this crumbling world adapt, and what will emerge from its ashes? Crete without kings. In the wake of devastation, Crete stood at the precipice of a new world, one where the echoes of its once great palaces seemed to fade into distant memory. The Minoan civilization, renowned for its palatial grandeur and intricate trade networks, had met its untimely end. What was left in the ruins were not only shattered stones, but the broken legacy of kings, gods, and rituals that once held sway over the island's people. The collapse of the Minoan palace system was not a single cataclysmic event. It was a slow, almost imperceptible fall, like a city that crumbles into dust over generations. Once, the Minoan elites had presided over island-wide feasts and grand religious ceremonies, their power flowing from the heart of magnificent structures like Knossos. But as invasions from the Sea Peoples, earthquakes, and internal unrest tore through Crete, these palaces became mere ghostly remains, abandoned by the aristocrats who had once ruled there. Now, in the absence of kings, the island's villages persisted, but they were worlds apart from the mighty centers of power they had once been. The bright frescoes of gods and mythic beasts were replaced with humble hearths and the work of farmers. The people still lived, but without the glamour of their past or the guiding hand of centralized rule. Where once there were feasts, now there were daily struggles for survival. This was not a kingdom. It was a land of fractured communities, each living in isolation. The political structures of old had dissolved into a patchwork of local powers, where the only allegiance was to the soil beneath their feet. The grand ceremonial rituals that had once united the island under a divine king were now mere stories whispered in the dark corners of homes. Yet amid this new, quieter order, there lingered an uncomfortable question. Could Crete, after centuries of centralized power and glory, truly endure without kings? Was the island's legacy doomed to be nothing more than a forgotten myth? Or could new forms of leadership, more local and fragmented, take root, offering hope to those who remained? But even as Crete's survival remained uncertain, there was movement on the horizon, something ominous and foreign. Across the seas, a new force was rising, one that would soon make their mark on the Mediterranean's coast, the Philistines. What do you think? Was Crete's fall a natural consequence of the Bronze Age collapse, or was it something more? Drop your thoughts below. What kind of society do you think would have risen if the Minoan elite had survived? Would the island have been able to rebuild its former glory, or was the age of kings truly over? Stay tuned as we delve into the arrival of the Philistines on the Mediterranean coast and the new world that would soon emerge from the ashes of the old. Next, we turn to Philistines on the coast, where a new chapter in the Mediterranean story unfolds. The Philistines are on the move. Who are they, and what will they bring to a world already teetering on the brink of collapse? Seeds in the ashes. The ashes of the old world still smoldered in the Mediterranean as the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse began to rebuild amidst the ruins. The once great cities, now reduced to rubble, had left a void where power, trade, and culture had once flourished. But the people who remained, whether Canaanite or Philistine, were not ones to simply fade into history. The collapse had shaken the world to its core. Yet in the silence that followed, there was a quiet resurgence of life, a whispered promise that the end was not truly the end. Amidst the ruins of cities like Ugarit and Ashkelon, there was a slow and painful rebuilding process. The Canaanites, now scattered and divided, sought to preserve their legacy while adapting to an ever-changing world. The rise of small, isolated villages in the Levant hinted at the survival instincts of the old kingdoms. But something darker loomed. The world had changed, and with it, the balance of power. The Canaanites could not hold the line forever. The cracks in the foundation had been exposed, and soon new players would step onto the stage. The Philistines, seafaring newcomers from the Aegean, had arrived in waves, their ships carrying them along the Mediterranean coast like a rising tide. Armed with iron weapons and unfamiliar customs, they began to settle on the fertile coastal plains that had once been home to the Canaanites. Unlike the nomadic invaders of the past, the Philistines weren't here merely to plunder. They came to establish dominion. They didn't just settle on the ruins of the old cities. They transformed them into something new. Yet the Philistines' arrival was not a sudden invasion, but a gradual infiltration. Their culture, though distinct, began to intertwine with the Canaanite traditions they found in the coastal cities. The clash of cultures was inevitable. Newcomers with foreign ways of life against a backdrop of Canaanite customs, rituals, and beliefs that had been in place for centuries. The first sparks of conflict would ignite as these two cultures tried to coexist in the same space, their old identities crumbling under the weight of change. But for all their might, the Philistines were not immune to the same forces that had ravaged the older civilizations. Their new world was not built on stability. It was built on constant negotiation, survival, and adaptation. In this volatile environment, survival wasn't guaranteed. The survivors of the Canaanite world still remembered the old ways, yet they were now caught between a desire to preserve their heritage and the pressure of new, more aggressive influences. The stage was set for a conflict of identity, where the future of the Levant would be determined not by the might of any single empire, but by the interactions of these emerging powers. The question looms: can the Philistines hold their ground in this fragile new world, or will they be undone by the very survival instincts that allowed them to rise? As the Levant begins to take shape in this new world order, a new force is coalescing. Soon, the power structure of the coastal cities will be solidified, and the rise of the Philistine Pentapolis will mark the first significant chapter in the struggle for control of the Mediterranean. What will it look like when the 5 cities of Philistine power emerge? And how will the ancient world adapt? The answer lies just beyond the horizon. But first, we must examine how the Philistine Pentapolis takes root. How did these 5 cities form the core of Philistine power? And what did their creation mean for the Levant and the world beyond? Stay with us as we uncover the shifting dynamics of the Mediterranean, the creation of these new city-states, and the profound implications of the coming change. Next, the Philistine Pentapolis emerges, a network of cities rising from the ashes, setting the stage for power struggles that would ripple across the Mediterranean for centuries to come. Will these 5 cities bring unity, or will they become the source of internal division? Philistine Pentapolis emerges. They came ashore with weapons in hand, but what they left behind was a civilization. In the smoking aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, few expected order to rise again. And yet, along the battered southern Levantine coast, 5 cities began to stir: Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, Ashkelon, Gath. They would not rebuild what was lost. They would invent something new. We call them the Philistines, but they were never just pirates or plunderers. These were seafaring refugees, fractured survivors of failed empires, Mycenaeans, Anatolians, Cypriots, bound together by displacement and a desire to endure. In the chaos, they found something resembling stability and seized it. By 1150 BCE, these 5 cities formed the Philistine Pentapolis, an alliance of port strongholds that pulsed with iron, trade, and bold reinvention. Fortifications rose where villas once stood. Aegean-style hearths burned beside Canaanite shrines. Local gods were renamed, refashioned, or replaced entirely. The past wasn't erased, it was absorbed. But it wasn't all peaceful integration. Excavations at Ekron reveal a city built atop the ashes of its Canaanite predecessor. Broken altars, repurposed temples, a layer of trauma beneath every Philistine foundation. And yet signs of hybrid life bloom above it. Philistine Bikram pottery, uniquely decorated with birds and geometric patterns, begins to replace imported Mycenaean ware. These are not mere imitations. They are innovations, crafted by hands that no longer look backward, but inward, building a new cultural identity from scratch. The Philistines are no longer outsiders. They are settlers, farmers, rulers, and soon, rivals. But their power comes with proximity. To Egypt, they are an unpredictable buffer. To the inland hill peoples, they are a foreign elite. And to the Canaanite survivors clinging to their ruins, the Pentapolis is a ghost wearing another skin. But while the Philistines carved cities from conquest across the sea, one forgotten city was daring to rise again. A city torched in the fires of collapse, now flickering back to life. Rebuilding Tarsus begins in the rubble. Do you think the Philistines were invaders or refugees? Drop your thoughts below. History isn't just in the past, it's in how we choose to remember it. The return of a city thought dead, and the silent gamble of one Anatolian port in the Age of Ashes. Rebuilding Tarsus. The Hittites are gone. So are the traders of Ugarit, the scribes of Amar, and the lords of Alashia. For nearly a generation, Tarsus, once a thriving conduit between mountain timber and coastal gold, lay lifeless, choked beneath ash and memory. But from the debris comes movement. There is no proclamation, no new dynasty carving seals, and yet someone is rebuilding. This is not restoration, it is survival. Amid burned timbers and shattered amphorae, a second layer of life begins to form. The new walls rise rougher, the pottery thicker, the patterns unfamiliar, and in the deeper layers of dust, there are signs of both continuity and quiet revolution. 1. Iron blades, still crude, sharper than bronze. 2. Domestic kilns, not elite storehouses. 3. Tools, not treasures. Tarsus is no longer a Hittite hub. It is something stranger, a fusion point. Who were they? Refugees from the mountains? Displaced Cypriots? Escaped vassals of the crumbling East? We may never know, but they were not aimless. They reclaimed a crossroads in a world of severed roads. Tarsus didn't need a king. It had memory and flame. But memory alone would not be enough. To the west, Crete remained fractured. To the south, Philistine cities rose over Canaanite tombs. And to the north, whispers began stirring at the edge of a sacred cave. Somewhere beyond the smoke and ruin, an oracle prepares to speak again. If your world ended, would you rebuild from memory or invent from scratch? Comment below. What would your version of Tarsus look like? In the chaos that followed Empire's end, most cities crumbled into oblivion, but not all. Tarsus, buried near the mouth of the Cilician Gates, did not burn. It waited. Long before the sea peoples lashed the coasts, before Mycenaean palaces turned to graveyards, Tarsus had already learned to adapt. Built along a choke point between Anatolia's interior and the Levant's coast, it became a refuge, a relay, a riddle that the collapse could not solve. Excavation layers reveal something rare: continuity. Trade doesn't vanish here. It migrates inward. The city's new walls are functional, yes, but beneath them, something else is happening. A strategy, a synthesis, a second chance. But what happens when the coastline settles? Not with traders or kings, but with strangers who bring their own gods, languages, and iron blades. If you lived through the collapse, would you rebuild what was lost or start something new? Babylon rises, Marduk returns. Babylon was not dead, but it had forgotten how to breathe. Decades after the Elamites had carried away its greatest treasure, the statue of Marduk, god of order, justice, and kingship. The once mighty city drifted in spiritual exile. Its priests still lit the lamps. Its walls still stood. But the heart of its cosmos had been stolen. Then came a king who sought not just conquest, but restoration. Nebuchadnezzar the First, a prince shaped by ruins, rose with one mission: to return Marduk to his rightful throne. The campaign was swift, merciless, but what he brought back from Elam was not a trophy. It was a god's return, and with it, the breath of a civilization long gasping in grief. The ritual was more than ceremony. It was cosmic recalibration. Temples reopened, festivals returned, and with them, the scribes. Babylonian literature entered a new golden phase. Creation myths, legal codes, poetic hymns, all rewritten in reverence. What had nearly died in the fire of collapse was being reborn, tablet by tablet. This wasn't nostalgia, it was strategy. Nebuchadnezzar's revival wasn't just spiritual, it was political. A deliberate recentering of Babylon as the axis of legitimacy in a world still dizzy from collapse. But this act of restoration raised deeper questions. What exactly had been lost? The Marduk they brought home was the same, but the world he returned to was not. Many gods would not return, many cities would not rise again, and many peoples would now live in a reality shaped by ruins. What does a civilization carry forward when all that once held it together is ash? If your world burned, what knowledge would you rebuild first? Scroll down and tell us, what must survive collapse? The legacy of collapse. The palaces are gone, the kings are nameless, the scripts unread, but the survivors, they remember, not in scrolls, not in monuments, but in firelit stories, passed from trembling lips to young ears. Once we were many, in Byblos, in Tyre, in Sidon, former satellites of great empires. A quiet transformation begins. Ships return to the sea, but the routes are new, no longer for kings, now for merchants. From this broken coastline will rise a culture that gives the world its first true alphabet and charts courses that even the pharaohs never dared. Something stirs in the highlands. Small clans, once scattered, begin to weave a shared tale of deliverance and covenant. Later, they will be called Israelites, but now they are simply survivors, nomads shaped by memory and by the silence of gods who did not come when cities burned. Their story of exodus, of law, of conquest is not just scripture. It is a map of collapse, retold as destiny. In Carchemish, in Melid, in Kumu, new kings crown themselves in the shadows of Hattusa. They call upon the old gods, but their language is laced with Assyrian diplomacy now. These are the Neo-Hittites, scraps of empire clinging to mountains and memory. Their strength is no longer military, but their survival is political. It is not gold that shapes this new age. It is iron, crude, difficult, uglier than bronze. But it does not shatter, and neither do the people who learn to wield it. This new world is not born in temples, but in smithies, not from decrees, but from necessity. The gods did not end the Bronze Age. Humans did, through war, through greed, through silence. And from that silence, a new language begins to form. If your world collapsed tomorrow, what part of your story would survive the fire? Drop a comment. What would you leave behind? And what would you build next? If history's echoes moved you, like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice helps rebuild these forgotten worlds.